Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Easy English Podcast. I'm Adrian.
And I'm Nikki. We're excited to have you join us for today's episode, where we'll be diving into something that every English learner needs to master: the past simple tense of to be.
That's right, Nikki. Whether you're talking about where you were yesterday, how your weekend was, or what the weather was like last week, you'll need to use this essential grammar point.
We know many English learners find this confusing at first, especially when deciding between was and were. But don't worry. By the end of this episode, you'll feel much more confident using these forms.
We'll cover the basic rules, look at common everyday situations, and even practice with some real-life scenarios. Plus, we'll help you avoid those typical mistakes that many learners make.
So get ready to improve your English grammar in a fun and practical way. We promise to keep it simple and easy to understand.
Let's start with the basics of was and were. James, would you like to explain when we use each one?
Of course, it's actually quite simple. We use was with singular subjects, I, he, she, it, and were with plural subjects, you, we, they. For example, I was tired yesterday.
And they were late for the meeting. See how that works? Let me give another example. She was happy about her test results.
Exactly. Now what about making these negative, Sarah?
That's easy too. We just add not after the verb. So was becomes was not or wasn't, and were becomes were not or weren't.
Let me use both positive and negative forms in a story. Yesterday I was at home, but my parents weren't. They were at a restaurant. The food was delicious, but the service wasn't very good.
That's perfect. And for questions, we simply move was or were to the beginning of the sentence. For instance, were you at home last night?
No, I wasn't. I was at the gym. Was the gym busy?
Yes, it was. Look how natural that conversation feels. Remember, listeners, with I, he, she, and it, we use was. And with you, we, and they, we use were.
Here's a helpful tip. If you're unsure whether to use was or were, first identify the subject. The subject tells you everything you need to know.
Absolutely. Let's do one more quick example. The children were excited about the party, but the cake wasn't ready yet. The baker was still decorating it.
You know, Sarah, I think it would be helpful for our listeners if we shared some real-life situations where we use the past simple tense of to be. Should we talk about our weekend?
That's a great idea, James. Well, last weekend was quite interesting for me. I was at my sister's wedding.
Oh, really? How was it? Were there many guests?
Yes, there were. It was beautiful. The ceremony was outdoors, and the weather was perfect. My sister was so nervous in the morning, but she was absolutely radiant during the ceremony. All the guests were amazed by how lovely everything was.
That sounds wonderful. I was actually at a high school reunion last weekend. It was strange to see how much everyone was different after 20 years.
Were your old friends recognizable?
Some were, some weren't. My best friend Mark was there, but he was completely different from what I remembered. He was very thin in high school, but now he was quite muscular. The funny thing was, our old teachers were there too.
Were they happy to see their former students?
They were. Mrs. Johnson, our English teacher, was especially pleased. She was surprised that I became an English teacher myself. Speaking of which, where were you before you became a teacher?
I was a travel guide in Europe for a few years. It was an amazing experience. The tourists were always interested in learning about local history, and I was happy to share my knowledge. The pay wasn't great, but the experience was priceless.
That's fascinating. Were the different cultures difficult to adjust to?
At first, they were. I was confused by some customs, and the language barriers were challenging. But after a while, it was easier to adapt. The local people were very patient with me, which was helpful.
See, listeners? Notice how naturally we used was and were to describe past events, feelings, and locations in our conversation. These are situations you might find yourself in every day.
Now, let's talk about some common mistakes that English learners often make with the past simple tense of to be.
Yes, this is really important. One of the most common errors I notice is when students use was with plural subjects.
Right. For example, they might say, the students was in the classroom, when it should be, the students were in the classroom.
Exactly. Another frequent mistake is mixing up was and were with different pronouns. Let's give some examples. James, could you help me demonstrate some incorrect and correct uses?
Of course. Here's a common error. You was at the party. The correct form is you were at the party.
And I often hear students say they was happy instead of they were happy.
Something else I've noticed is that learners sometimes forget to change is to was in reported speech.
Could you give an example of that?
Sure. Let's say someone says, "The movie is boring." When reporting this later, students might incorrectly say, "She said the movie is boring," instead of the correct form, "She said the movie was boring."
Yes. Remember, if you join subjects with and, you should use were. For example, Tom and Mary were at the shop, not Tom and Mary was at the shop.
We should also mention the common confusion with negative forms. Some students say, "I not was," or "they not were," instead of the correct forms, "I wasn't," or "they weren't."
And here's something I hear quite often. Students using were with singular subjects like, the book were interesting, when it should be, the book was interesting.
Let's remind our listeners of the basic rule. Use was for I, he, she, it, and use were for you, we, they, and plural nouns.
And don't forget, in questions, we simply move was or were to the beginning of the sentence. Like, were you at home or was she busy?
Let's practice using the past simple tense of to be in some real-life situations. Sarah, shall we create some scenarios?
Great idea! Let's start with a conversation about last weekend. I was at a family reunion.
Let's try another scenario. Imagine we're talking about our first day at school.
I'll start. I was so nervous on my first day. The building was huge, and I
Were
was
your
completely
teachers nice
lost.
to you?
Yes, they were very helpful. The other students were friendly too.
Now, let's do one about a memorable vacation. Last summer, I was in Paris.
Really? Was it your first time there?
Yes, it was. The Eiffel Tower was incredible, and the restaurants were amazing. The only problem was that the hotels were quite expensive.
Let's try one more scenario. A job interview. I was at an interview last week.
How was it? Were you nervous?
Yes, I was very nervous at first, but the interviewers were really friendly. The questions weren't too difficult, and the office was beautiful.
These are all great examples of using was and were in everyday situations. Notice how natural it feels when we use them correctly.
Yes, and remember, listeners, practice these conversations with a friend. It's the best way to get comfortable with using the past simple tense of to be.